All right, guys. So this next section is all about SNES and Genesis versions. There was, games with the same title but a different version on these consoles. And I'd be remiss if we did not start out with Aladdin. And I've watched videos just to make sure I wasn't crazy. The Genesis version is superior in every way, shape, and form. Graphically, visually, sound quality. This is 1,000 times better than the SNES version, in my opinion. It's the right opinion. If you have ears and eyes.
I have to ask two questions when it comes to the Genesis version.
Sure.
One, how often did Aladdin wield a sword in
What
the
do you
Aladdin
mean?
movie?
How?
In the Aladdin
Okay.
movie, how often did Aladdin wield a
Sure.
sword?
Not
He was all
often.
about his acrobatics, and that's what the Super Nintendo focuses on. And two, why do all the guys turn into clouds of dust when you hit them with the sword?
It was the magic genie sound. And nowhere to go.
There you go.
No, I cannot argue that the Genesis version is excellent. They literally had Disney animators help them with the game. And so it looks like the cartoon.
It really does.
It is just beautifully done. I personally prefer the acrobatic feel of the Super Nintendo version, but there is no arguing how friggin' beautiful the Genesis one is.
Yeah, because the Super Nintendo one was made by Capcom.
Correct. They did a lot of Disney stuff back in the day.
They did. So even though they were both a side scroller platformer game, no, Genesis one hands down.
Yeah, I think it was like Virgin Media or something made the Sega Genesis version, and it was, I don't know. I don't know how much I played the SNES version. It's just because I remember playing it. I was just like, oh my god, this is not as good as the Genesis version. I went back, and to your point about the swords, they're video games. They're supposed to be fun.
Yes.
I'd much rather
Yes,
wield a sword around.
Fun could have been the answer to either of those two questions. This is more fun that way.
The SNES is a fine version. If that's what you had, I'm sure I would have really enjoyed it if I had an SNES. I do think the Genesis version is better in the circumstance. Just like I relinquished, earlier when we were talking about Contra, like I think that the SNES version is better than Contra. Very different than Hardcore, but I absolutely think Contra 3 Alien Wars is better than Contra Hardcore.
That I agree with too.
Fair enough. If considering that fact, then yes, I can concede that the Aladdin version on Genesis is a lot more fun.
Okay. All right. We're getting somewhere, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, so that's awesome. We got 2 Batman games on here. First of all is the Adventures of Batman and Robin, and then we have Batman Returns. And I did not play any of these, so I'm going to leave it up to you gentlemen to discuss.
So Batman, the Adventures of Batman and Robin. I think we talked about them before in one of our videos. Same title, completely different games. Complete art style, different art style, different mechanics. The Super Nintendo one was made by Konami, and it felt more like the animated series, whereas the Genesis one was made by another company, and it was insanely hard.
To our point with Aladdin, saying that with the Disney animators making the Genesis version look more like the cartoon, the Konami version on the Super Nintendo for the Batman animated series looked way more like the cartoon.
It did.
And therefore just gave it a better authenticity. The Genesis version is not bad, but the Super Nintendo one, it's like playing an episode of the show.
Yep. And the same thing goes for Batman Returns. Same title, totally different gameplay. Whereas I have to give it to the Super Nintendo one, which was a side-scrolling beat 'em up. And the Genesis one was, I don't know, Sega kind of dropped the ball on that one.
The Genesis one was kind of all over the place. They tried to add a lot of platforming elements to it that just didn't quite work. The Super Nintendo one had the bigger sprites. It had the black costume like in the movies.
They did. Yep.
Because the Genesis one looked a little more purplish.
It was like purple. Yeah, it had purple colors to it. And
yeah.
I'm going to give you my 2 cents. Completely unbiased. I've watched a comparison video of those 2 versions. The Genesis one looks like hot garbage, and the SNES one looks spectacular.
Okay. We were sugarcoating it, but yes.
I didn't play either game. I just watched a comparison video, and my God, I would have been so disappointed with that Genesis version. Why is he wearing purple? I know they did that in the NES, but I know they had to. They didn't have to do that in the Genesis version.
No. Maybe that's what they were trying to do, is monopolize on that NES Batman crowd.
I,
I don't know. And recently I found out that there's a developer that's converting Batman Returns Super Nintendo to the Genesis.
that's awesome. That's awesome. Well, there you have that. That pretty much sums up how good that version is for the Genesis.
Yep.
Next up, we got TMNT Tournament Fighter, and then we're going to talk about, of course, Turtles in Time and Hyperstone Heist. But let's start out with Tournament Fighter. These are two pretty different games between the Genesis and the Super Nintendo.
The Super Nintendo one controls a heck of a lot better than the Genesis one does. The Genesis one feels very
sluggish.
Yes, thank you, Wes.
Sluggish.
Oh,
I agree, but I will say one thing: the Genesis version looks better. I do think the graphics look better in the Genesis version, in my opinion.
I prefer the art style with the Genesis version as well.
But the controls, yeah, you're right.
Mm-hmm.
And for a fighter, controls are everything.
Correct.
Well, look, we all agreed on one. How about that? There's no fighting whatsoever. No trying to convince anybody on anything. TMNT Turtles in Time and Hyperstone Heist, great classic games. Turtles in Time is based off the arcade game. Hyperstone Heist is a version of that is different, geared towards the Genesis. And you guys can give your opinions. I think it's probably a draw. I think this is going to be tough to pick one or the other.
I think someone's going to have a great time regardless of which one they play.
Mm-hmm.
Correct.
I prefer Turtles in Time.
I think I do too.
I think the Super Nintendo has much more vivid colors when it comes to the Turtles palettes and whatnot, making each one look a little bit different than each other. I enjoy Turtles in Time so much more, but Hyperstone Heist is still a great game. You can't go wrong if you're looking to play a fun, especially couch co-op beat 'em up. It's definitely worth the time.
For the longest time, I knew the titles were different, but playing them, I'm like, it's the same game. Because I know at some point they kind of deviate. The Genesis version deviates and goes on its own. But yeah, it's a tough call because they both played really good. And being that Hyperstone Heist was like the first Turtles game to arrive on the Sega system, we took it and loved it.
Yeah, could have done a heck of a lot worse.
That's for sure.
But no, so Turtles in Time though, I have to get the nod for it because it was based off the arcade, so we got to go with that one.
Yeah, I think Turtles in Time gets a slight edge, but it's still very close. I mean, you're gonna have a good time either way. Mortal Kombat 1. Go ahead,
Oh,
Brian.
goodness. I want you guys to keep in mind, we haven't said this the entire time, and now we're doing the direct comparison. I had a Genesis as a kid. I wasn't just a Nintendo fanboy, but I got a Genesis later on in the life cycle, and I got it only to buy the games that I couldn't get for the Super Nintendo. So when I was a kid, my Mortal Kombat was the Super Nintendo version. I didn't get the Genesis when I played that at friends' houses. The fact that you had the code to get the blood for the Genesis makes it the game to play. Does it look better than the Super Nintendo version? No.
Definitely not.
Play better than the Super Nintendo version? No, but it's not a bad play, so I'm not going to go ahead and critique it for that. Does it sound better than the Super Nintendo version? No. Oh dear God, does it sound poor. But the fact that you could unlock the actual fatality and that you could unlock the blood, that made it the version to play. Even I can't, in my Nintendo fanboy, headspace, defend the Nintendo version for saying, yeah, we're just going to have sweat. That was just a stupid decision.
It completely defeats the purpose of the game.
Yes.
Like, that was the whole marketing behind the game. Everybody wanted that game. It's like, and Nintendo had a problem at that time already where people, Genesis had this whole, we're going to get into ad campaigns in just a few minutes. All this ad campaigns for, they basically made Nintendo look like the baby system the entire time. And then they go and they make that decision. Y'all ain't helping yourself over there. This is not a good move.
Now, if there's a company out there that knows how to shoot themselves in the foot, it's Nintendo.
But Mortal Kombat looked really nice on the Super Nintendo, it sounded great on the Super Nintendo.
It had a better controller, that's for damn sure, for a fighting game.
I kind of like that 6-button controller though. I really did.
It's not bad. I
was
still
the
think
6-button around when the first Mortal Kombat came out?
I think by then it would have been. Because I think it was a little bit after Street Fighter came out and everybody wanted to kill themselves with the 3 buttons.
having to press the start button to switch between kicks and punches.
Yeah.
Oh, goodness.
Horrible. Anyway, I don't know. There's advantages and disadvantages to each. Tasmania, big back in the day. Big back in the day during this period of time.
Yes.
Two completely different games.
Completely different.
Not even in the same world, these two games.
Genesis 1 being the better of the two.
Sure, because it was an action platformer as opposed to Outrun, which is what the Super Nintendo was.
When we talked about this ahead of time, I had to go back and see it. I had to see what the hell you guys were. I could not believe that was a game that they released back then. It's like a mobile game that they would release today. It's like an endless runner, is what it would look like.
Yeah.
Who wanted that?
It's literally a camera shot from Taz's back as he's running away from you.
To what end? Just to run? Did you ever watch the cartoon and we're like, man, I just want to see him run? Nope.
He didn't do his spin, like nothing. Like the Genesis one was a side-scroller platform game, and it looked fantastic. It looked like it was ripped right out of the cartoon.
Well, the Super Nintendo one didn't look bad. It just played horribly.
That's true. Tasmania, Genesis, very good game. Highly recommend you go get that. Again, it's probably not very expensive at all. I can't imagine that game's more than $30. Here we are, guys. The marketing of the Genesis versus the Super Nintendo. I will say it that way because Genesis was way more aggressive about things. I put a series of commercials in our shared doc for you guys to check out. I went through a bunch of commercials on YouTube just for like a reference to go back and refresh my memory. And Genesis, Sega, they were definitely the aggressors in that situation. There was a couple of commercials where Nintendo calls them out by name, but it's very rare. Usually they say things like our competitors or something like that, being much more buttoned up and professional, where Genesis was like, they suck! They're for babies, basically, right? They didn't actually say that, but that was the point that they were trying to get across.
Decide to step up to this kind of power, this kind of challenge, this kind of flying, crashing, feeling. When you decide to get serious, there's only one place to come, the games of Super Nintendo. No one else creates this kind of experience, because no one else creates these kinds of games. Now you're playing with power, superpower.
Well, the biggest advertising commercial that I remember vividly was the whole Genesis does what Nintendo don't. That was like all over the place.
Yeah, they started that advertising campaign back when the NES was out to go ahead and show, hey, we got 16 bits and this company's only working with 8 bits over here.
Genesis does
16-bit arcade graphics.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis does
16-bit arcade action.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis does
16-bit arcade hits.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis does
What Nintendo don't. The 16-bit Genesis system by Sega. Genesis does it all.
And then when they came out with the Welcome to the Next Level, which was the two 16-bit going head-to-head, they kept that aggressive tone. And I'm sorry, as a kid growing up in the 90s, the Genesis commercials were fantastic because those things were just, they were so entertaining. They were funny. They were edgy for the time. Like it was such a time capsule of what the 90s was.
I highly recommend you guys go back and watch those commercials. I'll probably embed one or two of them in here. They're awesome. They're fantastic, man. You know, there's like they'll make fun of Mario Kart in one. It was like tied to like the back of a truck. That was like the Nintendo. Genesis does what Nintendo don't.
Blast processing.
Blast processing. I think that was what it was. That's right. That's right.
The Sega Genesis has blast processing. Super Nintendo doesn't. So what's blast processing do? if you don't have blast processing?
Or the commercial where the salesman is trying to pitch the Super Nintendo and the camera is supposed to be the kid and it keeps panning back over to the Genesis. The guy's like, no, don't look at that. Look at this one. He's like, no, but I want Sonic.
Yeah, I want Sonic. Oh, it's so fast. And
Right. And they talk about the price. They're like, oh, and it's cheaper.
And it's cheaper.
Yeah.
Gotta go. Hey, guy, you're the first serious gamer I've seen all morning. Check this out. Brand new 16-bit Super Nintendo with Super Mario World. Wow!
What's this one?
Oh, this is a Sonic the Hedgehog from Sega Genesis. Hey, look at these radical colors, huh?
Wow, Sonic's fast, too.
No, over here.
I like Genesis, and it costs a lot less.
Wait, kid, that game
I'll
there.
take Sonic and Genesis.
I knew that.
Sonic the Hedgehog. More action, more speed. Sega Genesis, it's a whole lot more for less.
There was that one time that Super Nintendo went ahead and did the commercial when they came out with Mario All-Stars, saying, hey, we have this as a pack-in now, so you buy a Super Nintendo and you get 4 games for free. You buy a Genesis and you get none for free. Which one should you buy? So they started to play back, but not very much. Genesis was definitely the aggressor.
Okay, class, pop quiz. Question number 1. You want to buy a video game system. Super NES gives you 4 free games. Sega gives you no free games. Which do you choose? Number 2. Farmer Brown has 4 chickens to trade for a video game system. Super NES gives him 4 free games. Sega, no free games. Which should Farmer Brown choose? Number 3.
Buy any Super NES system, and for $3.50 postage, we'll send you Super Mario All-Stars. That's 4 games free. Now, who would miss an offer like that?
Could you repeat the question?
yeah, without a doubt, Sega was like a really aggressive with their marketing. I wish Nintendo was a little bit more aggressive, because I would have liked to see like some Nintendo commercials to see what they would have came up with.
Yeah, that would have been cool.
When they finally started doing the whole Play It Loud series was when they started getting not necessarily aggressive. They didn't get aggressive, but they got more edgy.
Yeah.
Yep.
Edgy Nintendo.
That's perfect with the quotes. That's literally what they did. The guy who was he's in a diner and he explodes because he's eating as much as Yoshi does. Like they came up with some creative things, but they never like attacked Genesis. I know it's the wrong console, but there was a Sega commercial trying to promote Game Gear, and the kid's like, oh, look, it's in color. My Game Boy's not in color. And he picks up like a stick and beats himself over the head with it. And then all of a sudden he starts seeing all these things in front of him, and then he puts his Game Boy in front of his face and goes, ooh, color now. Like, they were so mean. And it was all Tom Kalinske, the CEO for Sega America at the time, that was behind all that stuff. He was a genius when it came to those sort of things.
Oh yeah, man. He was the whole arm behind them doing so well in America that they went from, Nintendo had like something like a 90% marketing share or something like that, or market share, to like totally eating up like 40-50% of that. Like they took a huge market share away from Nintendo. Obviously that didn't last for very long, but it it was extremely effective at the time. And if Sega of Japan had let, Kalinske continue doing what he was doing, at least in America, they probably would have done much better than, telling him what to do. And obviously worked real good when Saturn rolled around and the 32X and all that crap.
Even being the Nintendo fanboy that I am, I would love to live in the timeline where Kalinske could have done what he wanted to with Sega, because I think it would have led to some great competition between them for years to come.
Yeah, man. And then eventually they die out and then Nintendo screws over Sony, and then we get the PlayStation now. They have a whole new competitor that they created themselves. Way to go.
Well, what's funny about that is Sega did the same thing with the chip that allowed the Super Nintendo to create Donkey Kong Country. They came to them first, and Sega of Japan said, no, we don't want to use that tech. And Kalinske was the one that said, why don't you go and talk to the Nintendo people? Maybe they'll do it.
Wow.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Man, that's crazy.
Yeah, I saw that in the Console Wars documentary.
Well, Kutaragi, who, was over in PlayStation, he was going to, he wanted the PlayStation to be its own thing anyway. So it just took a long time for him to, be able to follow through with all that. It took him forever because they didn't fully believe in it until obviously once the PlayStation 1 came out, they fully believed in it after a few months, But it was really hard for him to get people behind him in the company. That's why they had to reach out to those other ones. And then Nintendo was like, "Oh, we'll screw you over." He was like, "Man, what?"
No,
Oh,
you figured
God.
Nintendo went to what they did. Had Toshiba and Sony both make CD platforms for the Super Nintendo because Sega already had their Sega CD coming out.
Philips. It was Philips.
Was it Philips?
It was Philips.
Yep. That's how
why
the
we got the
CDI
CDI.
games like Hotel
Okay,
Mario and
okay.
stuff came out.
Okay, because I wasn't sure if it was Philips or if it was Toshiba. Okay, that's right for the CDI, and that allowed them to use. Yeah. Okay.
Those beautiful Zelda games we got.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I highly encourage everybody to go back and watch some of those commercials. They're very entertaining. You know, they're interesting. Sega had the better commercials for sure, but Nintendo had a great library. There was nothing to shy away from when you got games like Contra 3, Castlevania 4, Super Mario, Super Metroid. Come on.
Sega Genesis did a great job with the commercials, but Nintendo had one thing that they did not, and that was Paul Rudd.
Yes. And that one commercial, dude, he's like, what is he, like 17 years old in that commercial? It's crazy.
He looks just like he does now.
He does. It's so weird. It's so weird. He's got a baby face.
Yeah, you guys definitely have to go check out those commercials. They're definitely worth watching.
Yeah, his hair's like blowing back. He's like, oh.